Let's start for today. Uh, this session is about Thailand's Personal Data Protection Act, or so-called PDPA. Risk management is the responsible function who's taking care of personal data protection practices within the Dusit Thani. So today's content, I'm going to present to you about the Pdpa overview and personal data protection principles, personal data protection in practice, and next would be lawful basis for processing personal data, followed by consent, rights of data subject, and data controllers and data processor. And then I'll talk about data protection officer. Also going to mention about complaint and penalty. And I'm going to show you the comparison between PDPA and GDPR. And also data protection impact analysis assessment. The last one would be to present to you Dusit's data privacy management structure. Thailand's personal data protection overview. If you are familiar with the concept of data protection regulations in other countries, for example, GDPR or in Singapore, basically Thailand's personal data protection or PDPA adopt more than 95% of the GDPR. And the reason that we need to have this in effect because we want to make sure that to officially protect personal data and put into place effective remedies for data subject whose rights to the protection of personal data are violated. Basically, this PDPA will talk about data collection, data use, data disclosure, and rights of data subject. And as I mentioned earlier, it is this act adopt more than 95% from the General Data Protection Regulation or GDPR. So if you are familiar with that GDPR, you will understand almost like 95% of this personal data protection acts from Thailand. And then before I go further, I want to introduce you the characters or getting to know the characters in the PDPA. First one is person. When we are talking about person, it has been defined as a natural person or an individual human being, not a legal person. That means deceased person does not include in this regulation. By personal data, it means a piece of information that it has been used to identify a person, whether directly or indirectly, but it excludes the deceased person in particular. This is the definition based on the PDPA committee. As you can see, the personal data here, for the person who is deceased, it doesn't be included in this the scope of the PDPA. And next is data subject. Data subject is the owner of the personal data. That's a concept of data subject. In PDPA, there is no definition for the data subject. So I borrow from the GDPR. So GDPR define the data subject as identified or identifiable natural person. That's the concept of the data subject. Now that we know the three characters in the PDPA, next one, I want to talk about the personal data. As I mentioned to you earlier, personal data is any piece of information that can be used to identify a person, whether directly or indirectly. It can be further categorized into general personal data and sensitive data. For the personal data, it can be name, surname, date of birth, place of birth, sex, gender, race, and religion, photo. It's also home address, personal emails, phone number, identification card number, passport number, social security number, and employee number, including email address. But if the person used the company address under his name, so it will be counted as a personal data too. And also, technically, it's also include location data, internet protocol, IP address, cookie ID. Even for the in term of HR, it also include employment history, education history, health details, medical record, and criminal record. This is basically the big picture of the personal data. Like I mentioned earlier, it can be further categorized into sensitive data. So sensitive data, basically there is no clear definition about the sensitive data, but it has been defined as personal data relating to race, ethnic group, political opinion, religious or philosophical belief, sexual behavior, criminal records, health data, disability, trade union information, genetic data, biometrics data, and of any data which may affect the data subject in the same manner, which is not clear to me. Basically, when we classify the sensitive data, if you notice, these data, if they are misused, it's likely to result in discrimination. That's also one criteria. And it's also result in the serious physical harm and also some identity theft. That's how it can be, it has been categorized in sensitive data. However, in GDPR, there is no term as sensitive data. They use a spatial categories data in case that you found this word in somewhere else. So please know that this is a GDPR term. For the PDPA, we call it sensitive data. This might be a little bit confusing because at the beginning of this development of PDPA, there are lots of questions because they consider all personal data sensitive. But this is how we define the sensitive data in PDPA. The next character is, I want to talk about the data processing. By processing, likewise, the PDPA doesn't have a clear definition of the data processing. So I borrow from the GDPR. Basically, it means everything that we perform on a piece of personal data, we call it like data processing, whether collection of data, recording of data, organizing the data, structuring, storage, adaptation, basically everything that we did to the data, that it can be collectively called data processing. Whether it's going to be restoring documents in the warehouse, we shredding the documents that we already no longer use or something like that. We record a video, recording a CCTV, restoring IP address or MAC address. Altogether, what we call as data processing. And then the next character in the PDPA, we already know about the data subject. Next is data controller and the data processor. There's some concept of the data controller. It's the person or the juristic person that have power or duty to make a decision what they want to do with the data. They have the power, then they have the authority and duty to make a decision. We call them the data controller. However, in reality, it's not that clear cut. So we have to ask ourselves whether we fall into the category on the right-hand side, whether if we are the one who decide what, when, who, how to process the data. So we'll be a data controller. And we decide whose data to be processed, decide the target. So we are the data controller. Whether we have benefit or we get a business benefit or other benefits from processing the data, this is the key question. And whether we have direct relation with the data subject, and whether we can freely determine how we want the data to be used, something like that. That's the concept of data controller. The next one is data processor. Basically, it's a person who received the orders from the data controller. They can process the data only what they have been told by the data controller only. By law, if they process or do something beyond their authority, they will be considered or regarded as a data controller, which is different in terms of penalty and responsibility. For some example, do you think what is the relationship between Agoda and Dusit? Agoda provides Dusit guest information, name, surname, contact information, and period of stay. And Dusit use that information to reserve the room for the guests. And when the guests check in, we also ask the guests to register. We make a photocopies or passport. So in this case, is Dusit a data controller or Dusit is a data processor? Many people thought that we are only processor because Agoda give us information, they order us, but actually because we get the benefits from that personal data, so we'll be regarded as a data controller. There is a difference between data controller and data processor when we do the contract, because the binding or a commitment or responsibility is different. So that's why we need to be able to distinguish when entering into a contract, are we a data controller or are we a data processor?